as you know, I'm David Ellwood, and there was a time when I actually spent a lot of time on inequality and poverty sorts of issues. Now I'm interested in the upper end of the distribution sometimes. But this is a chance to have a conversation, and this is going to be framed precisely as a conversation. I guess I screwed up and didn't let the bumper happen. So make your bumper happen.
I did.
Oh, you did. It happened. I just didn't notice.
I just turned it down.
Okay, thank you. The Sandy Jencks, this is absolutely true, is kind of my favorite scholar in the world. He is, nothing better than getting started with low expectations. But what makes him special is something very straightforward. He cares enormously, very, very deeply. And part of caring so deeply is being absolutely as straight and cautious and thoughtful as he can about what's really going on, what's happening, what policies might work, and what might not. And as a result, when Sandy says something, I always believe it. That doesn't, and if you go to Sandy and say, that didn't make sense, Sandy say, really? Well, let me think about that, and go back, and he'll come back to you with numbers, and 95% of the time he'll come back and say, actually, David, no, this is why it did make sense, and the other 5% he said, you're right, I'll change it. And it doesn't matter whether what he finds or what the evidence shows is entirely consistent with his deep philosophical beliefs and what he hopes for. He'll let the chips fall where they may. And so on topics ranging from poverty to inequality to social policy more broadly, and homelessness and crime and education, Sandy's a voice you should always listen to. So we're just going to have a conversation because we've been long and old friends, and we just like to reflect on the current state of inequality, what's going on, and along the way hopefully illustrate kind of how we perceive what's been happening, especially Sandy perceives, and go from there. But I want to start by asking you, Sandy, inequality isn't exactly what most people grow up thinking they want to study. And how did you get there? I mean, how did you arrive at this spot where so much of your life has been devoted to this issue?
Well, it's a good question. There's a story about a meeting of the group of Fabian socialists in England who wanted to talk about inequality, and they saw that there was this person who'd written this very important paper that had gotten a big splash about inequality. And so they asked him to come and speak to them. And he arrived, and he got up on the blackboard and he started writing mathematical formulas on the thing. And it turned out he had written a paper about how to decompose inequalities in mathematical terms and which ones count and so forth. And they naturally were a little taken aback, but they all sat quietly. And I thought, this has not been my experience, so maybe I should move to England. Anyway, I got going on this because the first things I was interested in the 1960s when I got out of Harvard College were things to do with schools and education. And then we had a war on poverty, and we had a huge explosion of interest in education. And in particular, we had a political situation in which the Council of Economic Advisors and the President and all sorts of other people with more influence than me were saying that improving the education system was the way to solve a whole variety of problems that looked to me like problems of inequality rather than just problems of low levels of outcomes. That is, if you think about what happens if you give everybody more schooling, your first order response would be, well, gee, everybody will be better off. But would this narrow the gap between any particular two groups? Not necessarily. And would it eliminate bad jobs at the bottom? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe moving fast food is just not a very good job no matter how much education you have. And maybe it doesn't pay very well no matter how much education you have. or can't, because people won't buy fast food if it costs too much. So I became what I now think of as like a climate skeptic, except I was an education skeptic only in the limited sense that I didn't think this was a cure for inequality, not in the sense that I didn't think it would do a lot of good. And my prejudices on that score were greatly enhanced by looking at a table at some point, which showed that if you looked at college graduates, their incomes were way more unequal than the incomes of high school graduates. So I began to think, well, if I got all the high school graduates to go to college, how would this affect the distribution of income? And I thought, this doesn't look promising at all. Now, there are many reasons you could think why this might be true, but it just made me feel we weren't thinking straight about this issue. And then I got to thinking about all the other things that we were trying to fix that were going to solve social problems. And in each case, family background, test scores, education, so forth, I thought, we're talking about this as if it's going to narrow the gap between different people. And yet, what it looks to me like is if you do something or other to improve this, everybody's going to get ahead. And then I saw a study which really shook me, which was a study of the Sesame Street program, which was supposed to improve the achievement of low-achieving poor students. Who were the big beneficiaries of this in the early years? Middle-class kids. Why was that? Their parents made them watch it. The poor kids' parents didn't make them watch it, and their older siblings didn't want to watch it, so they changed the channel. I thought, oh, this is really unsettling. We need to think some more about this. And I ended up writing a book. This was in the early 1970s, which was about how changing what happens to individuals, their qualifications and so forth, is probably not a very effective strategy for reducing this.
So that book it's called Inequality, and it was done with a number of colleagues while you were here, actually, in Cambridge. And it had one really striking fact, and the striking fact for me was if you compare the incomes of two brothers.
If you compare the incomes of two brothers, according to that estimate, they're about, the disparities between two brothers are about 15% less than between random people you just picked out of the population. I would now say that was a slight misestimate. I'd say it's probably closer to 20% less.
But just let that sink in. Two brothers born in the same family, obviously coming from the same genetic pool, with a relatively similar environment and so forth. You're looking at only, if you could make everybody like two brothers, and of course two sisters similar and so forth, you can reduce inequality by 20%. And that is an unachievable goal. I mean, that you could actually make people look like two brothers, and you say, oh, how can this be? This is so inconsistent with everything that we know and see and feel and comprehend. And so first, what was the story there? How do you explain that?
I think the way I explained it to myself, and I still think it's probably right, the easiest way to think about it is, where do you see compressed distributions of income? It's not where people all grow up in a kibbutz. I mean, actually, you do see a very compressed distribution of income there, but the causal arrow is running the other way. It's not where the distribution of education is very equal. It's in, let's say, Scandinavian countries, which have compressed the distribution of income as a matter of politics and social policy and so forth. And the differences between random people in Scandinavia were much smaller than the differences between siblings in the United States. Well, that's a sobering fact. You say, okay, how did that happen? Well, it didn't happen because of the policies that we were talking about in the United States. It happened because they set about to make it happen with using the power of government and all of the social pressures and so forth that flow from that, and strengthening unions and You know, you can write a whole script about how that came to pass. But it's a very different strategy for thinking about inequality. And I think if you go back to the question about why are we so variable in the United States, it's because the kinds of things that two brothers are likely to do end them up in slots which, in the economy, which are very differently rewarded economically for reasons that may or may not be kind of rational market reasons. Often they are, sometimes they aren't. But the workings of the free market don't produce equal results, even for people of equal ability. Now, why would that be? Well, a lot because there are a lot more people at Harvard College who want to write the great American novel than there is demand for their novels. And most of them don't end up making very much money in this line of work. Or they want to paint pictures, or they want to be school teachers, or they want to do all these things which are not very well rewarded, despite the fact that, you know, if they just played their cards a little differently, they might have ended up at Goldman or something.
I certainly think of that now and then, whether I should have studied poverty or gone to work for a hedge fund.
But you could have just studied finance and stayed in the university, David.
It's true. That would be better.
David, do you want us to ask questions while you're talking, or hold it to the end? How do you want to run it?
Let me go a couple more minutes and then we'll turn to questions. This book created a firestorm, though. I mean, the facts are, as you've described, it was a firestorm. I mean, you were just pummeled. Why did that happen?
Well, if I were doing a political show, I would say because we didn't cite enough black scholars when we talked about some of these issues. But that's a sarcastic and unfair response. I think it created a firestorm largely because people didn't hear the message that this was about the effects of different things on the dispersion of income. They thought it was about the effect on the level of income. So people were saying, what do you mean education doesn't matter? You know, lots of economists have shown that education has an effect on income. And I would say, yes, it does have an effect on income, but giving everybody the same amount of education doesn't guarantee that they'll have the same income, and so forth. But the thing that really struck me about the firestorm was it was largely confined to the United States. The reviews elsewhere got what the book was about, which was about the unequal distribution of income. In the United States, there didn't seem to be, in the class of people who reviewed books generally, a group of people for whom the word distribution of income seemed very meaningful. I mean, they were thinking about growth and getting ahead and how did immigrants do as well as they did, and all of that.
And indeed, much of my life I've spent focused on poverty, and even the way people measure poverty in the United States, it's an absolute number. It's are you above a certain number, and we adjust that number by the cost of living, basically. But in most of the rest of the world, it's an inequality measure. It's relative to the median income or some such thing. And so this really brings me to the next question. In a moment, we'll open up a little more, but which is, I'm just sort of astonished about how inequality is now a big topic. And the reason I am is I spent much of my life studying poverty. I've always cared about inequality enormously. And I quickly learned in the political realm, if I talked about inequality, people would die of boredom. They would be, who cares about that? I'm just worried about the poor. And so focusing on low-income families, if I was really wanting to talk about inequality, I would call it disparities. Somehow or other that worked better. And so I could talk about if you work, you shouldn't be poor. That was a powerful notion for a lot of people. But there was just this sense that, I don't mind if people work hard and do well and get a lot of money. That's no problem. That's the American way. I do worry when there are people left behind at the very bottom. Now the conversation seems to be genuinely framed as inequality, the growing gap between rich and poor, the CEO that makes, you know, so many more times than his or her employees. Why do you think that happened? Why is it suddenly on the political realm? Why are people so energized by this?
If I had to pick one answer, which is always a mistake. I mean, anything big that happens in a society, there's more than one thing going on that feeds into it, or otherwise it wouldn't be that big. But if I had to pick one, I'd say it's because the middle class isn't doing very well. There hasn't been much growth in the middle. And that makes people think or listen to the argument that is made, well, all that money is going to the rich and none of it's going to us. But us now is not the bottom 10% or the bottom 20%, but the bottom 80%, let's say. That's a little overstated that that's true, you know, but in the last few years it has been true. I mean, it's been strikingly true during the last 6 years that the share of income going to the top has been going straight up. And that's partly because, of course, the amount of income going to everybody else has been going down, and so if their income stayed the same, their share went up, but still.
But what's the figure on the fraction of all the growth in income that was gone?
Well, the worst year, it was 91%, I believe.
91% of the growth of income went to the top
1%.
1%.
Although the top 1%, although it's a nice tidy group, is somewhat misleading. You know, for one thing, the top 1% is not such a small group of people. There are, you know, 3.2 million people in the top 1%, which makes you think, gee, that's not just, you know, but it's the top 0.1% probably is a more realistic group to focus on, because the higher up you go, the more the disparities in growth hit you in the face. And if you say, where did most of the growth of the top 1% come from? It's from the top 10% of the top 1%, as it were, and so forth.
Well, it is interesting, though, because this is a somewhat new phenomenon. For a long, long time, the middle class, you know, from World War II well into the 70s, and depending on how you count it and so forth, well into the 80s, was doing very well. And then it just stopped. And it really is true, no matter how you cut it, that the only reason middle incomes in the United States, at least, have gone up is by sending extra workers. More people are earning money outside the home. And that there's just been this astonishing rise at the very top. My last question before I open up for all this, and we'll certainly talk solutions. Why did that happen?
I think one way you can think about inequality, a useful way, I think, is that three things have happened over the last generation or so. One is what happened at the bottom, the poverty rate. It was coming down, 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 and then in 1973 it stopped going down, and it's sort of just gone up and down in the business cycle since then. So the bottom has been stuck since the early 70s. If you look at the middle, what's going on is that returns to schooling have been getting bigger and bigger. We haven't raised the college graduation rate as fast as the demand for college graduates. So their incomes have been pulling away during most of the last 40 years from those of people in the middle. The gap between the 90th percentile and the 50th percentile, between the middle and, not the very rich, but the middle and the Harvard faculty, let's say, has been widening. And that, I think, is just a traditional story about a shortage of skills, which lots of economists have written about. And then there's the top. And I think a lot of things are involved there, but perhaps the most important is the change in the way people who were in corporate boardrooms understood their mission. That, you know, in the 1940s and 50s, the normal thing to do was to say, well, we have this amount of profit and we have to give some of it to the workers and some of it to the executives and some of it to the stockholders. And how much is some of it? Well, nobody quite had a clear idea, you know. In the world of psychology, if you have three groups of people, you say, how should we divide them? Well, how about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? But, you know, there was no...
But, you know, I've been reading about the progressive era a lot lately because it's reminiscent of this period. I get the sense that people were spending a lot of time there and thinking about how do I hand out my profits to the workers and all that.
Well, if you look at the share going to the top, you would say, that's right. It's about, you know, the progressive era was an era of extreme inequality. And there was a lot of discontent with that fact. It didn't come down until the Depression hit. And so I concur that the people who are running those corporations were not much moved by these arguments.
Yeah, I want to give you all a chance to ask questions. At some point, I'd like to ask you about what you think about Piketty and others, but let's, yeah, go ahead.
First,
Please identify yourself.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, Steve. Steve Simmons. I'm on the Dean's Council. I'm also maybe a business guy, one of those top whatever percentage you talked about. But I also, in Connecticut, where I'm from, I chair the Business and Civic Leader Education Reform Group, which is what my question is about. First, let me say I think the discussion's excellent. It's just well put, David. Very fascinating. Sir, I'm sorry I don't know I should have studied your research, I don't know it, but one thing you said, that's why I raised my hand before, at least in Connecticut, and I think it's pretty much true in many other states, we found that the average low-income third grader, not all, but the average, read at kindergarten or first grade levels. In our state, 62% of low-income children drop out of school. But there were a whole bunch of other statistics, but you get the point. And you were saying something to the effect, and I may have misinterpreted, that education wouldn't necessarily close the gap. And it's our firm belief and our view that when you get kids dropping out of high school that can barely read, they just don't have the skills to succeed or increase their income at all. And in our state, 45% of the people that do graduate high school, white, black, green, whatever their color, and whatever income, still need remediation. So it's our view that education can close the gap. We've done a lot. In fact, in the last year, Connecticut was the best state in the country to sort of close the gap a little bit closer to this. So it's just a general question in response to your comment.
Well, we need to talk about absolute and relative here, I think. That is, I certainly don't disagree with you that if you improve the skills of kids, their job prospects will improve. I mean, I think there's no one who really disputes that, to the best of my knowledge. And that would be true in any world I can imagine, because an employer will hire the most skilled person they can find, and they start with the best people they can get, and if it's a really tight labor market, they may go down to people that they would never even consider otherwise. The people who are getting jobs at McDonald's will sometimes be a lot more competent than other times. When it's a slack labor market, they're pretty good in many cases. When it's a really tight labor market, they're giving jobs to people who are just the people you're describing, because there's nobody else who's willing to work for that wage. So I'm not at all disputing that getting the skills up will increase people's prospects of working. I do think that's a little different, although not necessarily totally different, from compressing the distribution of what they earn when they get a job, because those things are not driven in quite the same way. But even there, I think that there's some evidence that it will make some difference. And it certainly will make a difference if you're thinking about our labor market as being integrated with the global labor market, so that there are unskilled immigrants coming into the country all the time. Well, if you're turning out kids who aren't competitive with the high school graduates coming from Mexico, you've got a big problem on your hands getting them a job. If those people didn't exist, they might be able to get, people who we were training might be getting some of those jobs, and employers would be scratching their head and say, how can I teach this kid to do a decent job? But if they can teach a Mexican kid to do that easier and quicker, then you get a different result.
Maybe,
So I'm not disputing that part.
Yeah, Sandy spent a lot of his life actually trying to think about what works in education in terms of bringing people up from the bottom. And for me, perhaps a victim of my own education, I very much have focused on that bottom. That's the part that the savage inequalities that just are outrageous. You go to schools that people aren't being taught and so on. And so I think that's exactly the right thing to do, and there are examples where we really can make a difference, and maybe later we'll get Sandy actually to talk about what it makes for good schools. But I guess the point not to be lost is the two brothers' point at the end of the day. There's a broader set of forces that are affecting the fact who gets ahead and so forth. And in the recent period, and I think this is why, in my own view, it's suddenly so interesting politically, the widening has not been, there's this group left behind and the rest of us are moving along. There have been periods in American history that look like that, although not a lot. It's almost always been the case that the poor have kind of kept up with the middle class for a variety of reasons, because if the middle class wages are going up, then that pushes wages at the bottom and so forth. And schools have improved. And then there was a long period when we were getting more education in general, and that everybody was moving along. What's unusual about the recent period has been this dramatic return, actually, to the levels of inequality we hadn't seen really since the turn of the century, progressive era, and so forth. And so much of that is driven by the widening at the top. And that, I think, is just something to be aware of. And I think Sandy's way of decompressing is actually quite helpful. There are a set of forces that affect people at the bottom, and those are things that range, in my own view, from lack of education. Let me give you another example. On welfare reform, my whole pitch, or a lot of our pitch during the Clinton administration was, look, we've been in the check writing business. Nobody wants really to be in the check writing business. The check writing business is sort of almost like giving up on people and saying, now you can say, look, everybody deserves a guaranteed income and so forth, but in fact that's not what people want. If you spend time in welfare offices or with welfare systems, they want a chance to have some control over their lives. And the welfare system does exactly the opposite of that. It basically brings you in, requires you to give way more information than any middle-class person would ever be willing to give. Penalizes you any minute you get income. In fact, pardon me, but we used to talk about, in the welfare system, this is absolutely true, we were especially worried about cases where an error was found, where, in other words, when an auditor would go back in, there's an error. So we had a whole class of cases that were called error-prone cases, and our goal was to minimize the number of error-prone cases. And what was an error-prone case? Someone who had income. Someone whose income went up and down. I mean, it's really easy to calculate what the check is for someone with absolutely no income. And so we basically sent the message, both in the way we took away income as soon as you went to work, as well as but even more about just the culture of welfare offices, that a good welfare recipient doesn't report income. And so that's the bottom. But then there's the middle group, which has really been lagging behind for quite a while, and that's the question, that whether that's tied to the top or that's something else. But a lot of this is, there is this increasing skills of the economy, and those people that aren't really well skilled, that can't take advantage of the global market and so forth. And that's a story you've all heard, and it's real, and there's a real part of that. That's a really big part of the story. And that's where getting people from high school into college and getting serious college education can really make a big difference. And that's really slowed down that growth. But there is still more. And a huge part of the national income of late has been going to that very top.
Sorry, just one quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Given that second fundamental point you made, that there is more in the middle class, who cares if the top 0.01% is making all this money? I mean, most, not all, but most of them, like David or Les Rex, in the end, are probably giving it away. Isn't the real discussion not about them, it's really what do we do about lifting up the middle class? As opposed to getting into us versus them political
Yeah.
argument.
Andy?
I think it's very hard to see how you're going to get a substantial improvement in the position of the middle class unless there is some political push to divide the money that comes into the firms that pay middle-class people in a different way than we have been trying to do in the last 25 years. I'm not saying it's impossible, I mean, but if you go back and say, well, when did working-class wages rise? Well, working-class wages began to rise quite rapidly in the period in which we started unionizing, and then they, as the unions fell apart, which was not long after they were strong, the upper blue-collar class gradually began to fall behind. Now, what's that telling us? I think it's just telling us that when the auto companies thought about how much they had to pay, they were thinking a lot about what's the cost of a strike and what are the politics of this and how mad will the public be and all that kind of thing. And they're not worried about those questions anymore. That changes the calculations about how much do we have to pay workers, or should we move our plant to the south, or should we outsource this to another country, and so forth. Now, there are plenty of people who have skills that are in short supply, and those people are not subject to the same kind of pressures, but getting everybody into that happy position would be a really hard thing for me to imagine doing. I mean, a lot of these people are not going to be, the best person at doing color correction in New York City. Well, I happen to know somebody who seems to be that person. He happens to be my son. But, this is an esoteric niche which commands a nice salary, and it doesn't depend on that much on social norms. But most of us can't be the best at any one thing. I mean, it's like, I'm not the best academic in the world, contrary to my friend over here.
There's a small group of these things.
But, these niches are somewhat limited by the nature of work and human beings and so forth. And there has to be some sort of a social impact.
But let's push this question further, because it's a terrific one. And indeed, I would have said for most of my life, that's the way I think people thought. But I think one huge difference politically is people are just fine with folks at the top getting richer so long as they're getting better too. But now there's this genuine sense of the middle class that your kids will do no better than you, maybe worse. And that's a fundamental, and that's politically potent. And the other interesting question is it also economically potent? In other words, is there in fact? And let's quickly talk about Piketty. Is that how we say it? I think it's Piketty, but it's emphasized last.
You have to emphasize every syllable equally in French.
Okay, well,
and if you can learn to do that, you will be a great
surely
success
someone
in
here
France.
will
I cannot do it.
correct us. But what's his story?
Well, I was thinking about his story when you were talking about this. His story is fundamentally that there isn't any natural division of income between income from capital and income from labor that you can just count on happening because of the market. That it's always a matter of political institutions and social pressures and stability of government and stability of the society and so forth. And that the last 50 years, well, not the last 50 50 years. The 50 years, let's say, from 1930 to 1980, or maybe in Europe from 1914 to 1980, were an exceptional period in which we had a collapse in income from capital, because a huge amount of capital, especially in countries like France and Germany, was just destroyed, first by World War I, then by World War II, partly by the Depression, which destroyed lots of family fortunes. And the result was that the stock of capital had to be rebuilt. And it had to be rebuilt physically, and it had to be rebuilt financially. And the people who were rebuilding it were, in many cases, not all, but most of them, were not people whose great-grandparents had made a lot of money. They were people who themselves were exploiting the opportunities that had come along during those periods. So you have more self-made men and so forth, but there still is this shortage of capital, but there's also a shortage of labor. All this work has to be done. You have to rebuild all this stuff. You have to, and then you have various technologies which also contribute to that. But in his view, it's an exceptional period. So it's the opposite of Bob Solo's whole story, where the division between capital and labor is basically stable. Interestingly, Solo has a review of Piketty in the New Republic, in which he says he's right.
That Piketty's right.
Yes. Now, I don't know how deep this goes, but it's a striking thing for somebody who got a Nobel Prize for doing one thing to say that his adversary is correct.
He's another one of those great ones. But so the story basically is that there's actually a race going on at all times. People with capital put their money into capital and they get a return. That's R. And simultaneously, the rest of the folks are getting returns as the economy grows. And if the economy grows faster than the returns to capital grow, then who owns capital is becoming a smaller share of total income, or vice versa. And in a world where there's a bunch of things that keep knocking back capital and encouraging growth, including population growth, by the way, that's going to be pushed back, right? And the claim is that if you stay stable long enough, and political institutions don't insist on something different, the returns to capital typically will exceed growth, and then capital will just keep accumulating more and more. Now, there are various disagreements, and I don't think we want to get into whether it's right or wrong at this stage, but the simple notion that there's nothing in economies that necessarily say you're going to stay stable at a place where you want to go, and that there are many pressures. You know, there are other arguments that have been used, right? There's one argument that is essentially technology this time around. Now, this argument's always used with new technologies, but this time we really mean it. That it concentrates a bunch of gains. I mean, you think about the profit per Apple employee, which is several $100,000 or some such number, and it's easy to see why. I mean, we increasingly get things when even the things we build that we want can be scaled almost infinitely at very little cost at the margin, and so that the person that owns the rights to those resources is the money pours in, and their employees, some of them are off, certainly out of the country, but increasingly they're not. I mean, we're going to have a manufacturing boom in this country, I think, and the robots are going to do it all. And so, yeah, manufacturing will return to the United States. Everybody's dream will be true, but it's just no one doing it. That's one theory. And there's another theory that that a fair amount of intellectual talent has been figuring out things like how to make money by making your transactions a few milliseconds faster in the stock market. And that's a zero-sum game. It's not like, you know, at least the railroad barons were building railroads. And so it's not that it's dishonorable work or anything, it's just zero-sum work. We're not actually adding to the total, we're redistributing what's in there. Somebody else lost while a bunch of other people gained. So all of those are things that you can say are stories why you might get this growth. And so then the question is, if this becomes something that is troubling and leaves the middle class behind and so forth, what is the policy story you ought to think about?
Well, if you're Piketty, it's straightforward. It's higher taxes on the rich. Well, you can't do that in one country.
By the way, I think that was kind of what you said in Inequality too, right, long ago?
I kind of, but only kind of. At the time, I didn't think the taxes on the rich when I was writing that book were a lot higher.
Yeah.
We were at 70% still.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the case, you know. But the point here is, in Piketty's view, that the effect of the wars, World War I and World War II, was to justify high taxes. The Civil War had the same effect in the United States, but after the Civil War, this tax, which was, as far as we can tell retrospectively, was also unconstitutional, leaving everything else aside. It went away. But war justifies high taxes. You know, if people are dying, if everybody else is giving their life, at least the rich should be giving their money. Well, then, guess what? When the war ends, governments are very good at thinking of all the things they could do with all that money that they were spending on munitions and tanks and airplanes and so forth. And even if they cut taxes some, you know, they think of, you know, we could finance a welfare state out of this. We could finance the National Health Service in England. We could finance, you know, this, that, the other thing. So some of the pressure for high taxes seems to last. And after World War II, at least, it lasted quite a long time. I mean, it was the early 1981 before taxes, the marginal rate at the top fell from 70 to 50%. Well, that's 35 years. That's a whole generation in which this hangover from war rates persisted. And at least in Piketty's view, that is a factor that keeps it basically keeps most people with wealth are in a position when the tax rate is like that, where they're spending most of the income they get from their wealth. Not all. If you're rich enough, you're never spending most of the income you get, but the fraction of the population that is rich enough so that they can reinvest 75 or 80% of their income and therefore keep their wealth growing relative to the larger economy is fairly low, and it gets substantially higher when the rates go down. Another thing which I feel I got a very clear insight in when I gave a lecture at one point at Yale, which was endowed by somebody who had made a lot of money. And he came to the dinner, and we were talking about income inequality, because that's what I had lectured on. And I said, well, so why do you think the best minds at Harvard College are now all going into finance when I was in college here, nobody thought about that. Banking was for dumbos who couldn't do anything hard like law or medicine or, you know, Sanskrit or whatever.
Any president excluded here, yeah.
Well, so he said, oh, well, that's really easy. He said, when I got out of Harvard, I didn't have any interest in going into the banking business either. Because I looked at the tax rates and I said, oh, well, that's too, you know, I'm not going to be able to really make a lot of money. My great-great-grandfather made some money, but I know I'm not going to make money in this environment. He said, then the tax rates came down, and I looked at it again, and I said, oh, well, now I can get rich. Maybe I can get really rich. And he did. Now, I don't know. This is an N of one, which if you're a quantitative social scientist, you don't really like building stories about social systems based on somebody you sit next to at dinner. Although I will say that I believe 90% of what human beings believe about the world is based on exactly that kind of evidence. So I don't know that I can.
All right, let's open up for more questions. Yes.
Hi, Thailand Business Leadership Board. My question is going back to the inequality issue and reducing inequality and picking up from the earlier remark on enhancing education. What do you think about the extra skills building and the apprenticeship program as is adopted in Germany, the DVET program, where industry takes the boys from school, they give them jobs for life, they train them. And this has been, I think, this program from being in Germany many times and understanding more about it, has been behind the German economic growth and high levels of employment. What do you think about it?
For a long time, I thought this was a great model. And then I noticed that the Germans, at least the German, the industrial leadership, was getting more and more dissatisfied with this arrangement. And I admit that I don't feel I know enough to know whether that dissatisfaction was right or wrong. It looks like a very attractive model. It also looks like a very un-American model, and whether it could be adopted in the United States is a whole other question. I mean, it's just, everything about it makes me think I would see resistance in this country to doing that. But then I see resistance in this country to doing almost everything, so, you know, they have their fun. You know, that's the thing about democracies, is we resist change, and when you have a constitution which makes it easy to resist change, you've got a big problem on your hands.
Let me add a variation on that theme, though, which is, you know, training programs for low-income families in general, particularly for people, particularly those who have left school. I don't mean people in school. Traditionally done very poorly. We have lots and lots of evidence of their impact, and their impact is typically quite small.
Those programs, though, are they're way less intensive than what's going on in
maybe
Germany.
6 weeks long.
Yeah,
I really think with
yeah,
6-week
it's
program, I'm going to change people's lives.
It's like saying, it's like summer school versus 4 years of college.
Yeah, and it's summer school for people, but my point on this is most of those summer schools are just like the schools that these people didn't do well in.
Yes.
You know, so, oh, good, I can put you back in the same environment, and you can fail again. This is great. I think the most promising of those programs, in terms of if you're taking people, low-income folks who are adults, and after all, that's a big part of the issue as well, because you know they're raising children and so forth, are those that are directly and closely connected to specific industries or jobs, so that when you are training people so that they can do something, one of the great tragedies of welfare reform, and I was an architect. One of the great successes is it got many more people working. It really did. It really did, because we rewarded work, we made work pay with tax credits, we pushed people out, we provided more daycare and so forth. And the number of folks working rose dramatically. I think the hope of many was that by getting them this first step, they would be on the first step of a ladder, and that they could climb up further and further. As it's turned out, it's basically a platform. Got them one step further, but there doesn't seem to be an escalator for most people. And that's a very interesting thing. And it's even the case, you know, if you're a home health care worker, it seems like it'd be very natural and easy to then go to being a nursing home worker, which turns out to pay more. But it doesn't happen. And so people do need sort of specific skills to help get into different industries and the like. What doesn't work at all, by almost all accounts, is the sort of GED trainings or whatever else. You can get a degree, but that's not what employers at that level in this day and age are looking for. So, okay, yes, Tony.
I'd like to sort of put forth two clarifying views for consideration, which are building on the arguments here that explain inequality. One view that you've alluded to at some level is that it appears to me that in Western economies, capital and its cousin technology are now displacing labor in the economy at a rate faster than Western economies can simply produce jobs. That's a structural issue that we have to deal with. The second issue is that one of the aspects that, sir, that you've alluded to that affect the allocation of economic returns, today favoring owners or capital over labor, is tax policy. I'm informed by your comment that really it was partly to reconstruct the destroyed capital of the Depression and war eras that tax policies were what they are. The U.S. tax system so favors capital over labor that it's inappropriate. And an example of that that's striking to me is our monetary policy. Now, we've got capital gains tax. Capital gains taxes are 20% now plus whatever, and tax rates on labor are substantially higher. But look at the monetary policy for the last half a dozen years, where you have zero interest rates that essentially subsidize capital, which displaces labor, and also bids down wage rates because labor is competing with capital. It's wacky. So I think I'm not sure what to do about the technological substitution or displacement of labor by technology, but I think there's a lot that can be done with informed tax policy to address the issue. But we're on the wrong side of these issues right now because the government policy is aggravating rather than attempting to ameliorate the inequality problem. How have I missed it?
I think you've got it. I don't think we should assume that the race between technology and skills always goes one way or the other. That is, if you think about the work on what computers do, the sort of standard finding is you displace workers in the middle of the skill distribution, not the workers that, the people in McDonald's are doing something that a computer can't do. The people who are at the executive level in a firm are usually at least pretending to do something that a computer can't do. It's the people of kind of middling skills who are most threatened by the efficiencies that computers can introduce, at least so the studies I've read suggest. And that's, of course, probably one factor in this, what's happened to the middle of the income distribution is that there's that kind of pressure. The relative numbers involved, I think, are not written in stone anywhere. I mean, the fact that the computer does this now doesn't mean that's what computers will be doing in 25 years. They may be displacing college professors, for God's sake. We'll be on strike. But the one thing you can count on is that it will be unforeseen, and the other thing you can count on is that we won't know what to do about it.
Well, edX is already displacing college professors. But tax policy, I think there's broad scope for changing the dynamic.
I think if you and I were dictators, that would be true. But the scope for actually changing it is, as we all know, rather constrained.
But if you change capital, this is just a point, but if you change capital gains encourages investment,
Yeah.
which in turn creates jobs. Just a point not to be lost.
I think that linkage needs to be examined. Steve, that linkage needs to be examined. I don't think that linkage exists the way it did.
So I think that tax policy is an interesting way, but I also think, just like you're saying in the American political order, it's very constrained. But my question is, it almost seems like the distribution between capital and labor ought best be sort of addressed by the government structuring that relationship between ownership and labor. So the minimum wage is one example. Another example from Germany, at least as I understand it, is a slightly different corporate legal order where workers are represented on corporate boards and so on. And so my question is sort of why isn't that the obvious solution? And just as a brief example, why is it that the minimum wage wasn't indexed to consumer pricing?
Well, I can answer that one. Certainly around when we expand the earned income tax credit and so forth. There's two reasons. One is the one that you're asserting, which is some political ones. But look, the minimum wage is a really crappy, very poorly targeted way to increase the incomes of the poor. It does do it, but it comes at a cost. And the two costs are this. First of all, a lot of the people that are paid the minimum wage are kids in middle class and upper middle class families. Just screw. And indeed, most of the people paid the minimum wage are not in poor families, though the poor families unambiguously benefit from higher minimum wage. And the second thing is there is clear evidence, or reasonably clear evidence, that a higher minimum wage does cause some job displacement. Okay, it's just true. Now, on net, my reading of the evidence is more income ends up going to low-income folks. You're offset. On the one hand, they have fewer jobs. On the other hand, they have more income per job. And on net, it seems to work in that direction. And it may push, the distribution up all in all. But look, I'm an economist, and the most important lesson of economics is when you squeeze on one part of the economy, it squeezes out somewhere else. And if you go to Scandinavia or spend time in those places, it really is a whole set of things not primarily, institutional rules that you must do X, Y, and Z. And by the way, inequality is growing a lot in Germany too. And so I think a lot of it does have to do with a set of cultural and political forces, as well as technological and other things that are moving along. I mean, but there is a good example here. During the last crisis, we basically were unwilling, most governments around the world weren't willing to go very far on fiscal policy to re-stimulate demand. There was an initial push. Fiscal policy to re-stimulate demand is almost always things that affect labor. Okay, we can rebuild infrastructure, we're gonna do a bunch of whatever things, unless we do it mostly through big tax cuts. On the other hand, obviously, if we use monetary policy, that tends to be, the main tool is to lower the cost of borrowing, and that has an effect on capital, and it stimulates the stock market, and things of that sort. But the main point I would just make is that is where we are politically, and that's a very strongly held view. It's no different from many other previous periods if you go back in history in terms of what happens. Last point, just before moving on, which is just the technology questions just are really interesting. I would just urge you to go back and read about the Industrial Revolution, the period of the 60s, and so forth. You will just be amazed. Except for adjusting for a few phrases that seem archaic, it is exactly the same discussion. Exactly. The difference is it really is. This is probably a much more extreme technological revolution. It does have very different impacts. But also, don't forget this technology has one other thing. This technology has a huge difference in its political impact because it enables people to connect with each other and scream louder, or things go viral, and it's made actually, I think at this stage, it's very hard to make the case, as far as I can see it, that this technology has made us better at made it liberation easier in this country. It's made anger easier. It's made caricatures easier. Now maybe that will change. I mean, we're just young and immature. I mean, most folks my age think of Facebook as this strange cult of self-revelation which will come back to haunt you when you're older. And I suspect that I'm going to be wrong about that. But being a parent, you have to have these views. So I think that it's yet to be written. But I do believe this may be a very unusual moment. And I guess part of what I'm just trying to emphasize is you ought to care a lot about folks at the bottom. I spend my life being worried about that. That is very important. It's very peripherally related to the forces that are shifting the things between the middle and the top. That's the part that I think. It isn't that there's a conspiracy of rich folks to steal from the poor. You could have made that case during the Robert Wiener era. That's not really what it feels like now. But maybe I'm just naive. So, other questions, comments? Yes?
I'm Louis Cabot. I'm probably one of the 1%. It seems to me that the real problem is not whether we have enough educated people. The problem is we don't have enough jobs.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we don't have enough jobs is because the economy is being held back because we're worrying about the deficit. Simple answer. Raise taxes and worry about the deficit by raising taxes, and everything else will begin to start working better again. And I think we ought to really be looking at that period right after World War II when the tax rate was 90%. And that lasted all the way through the Eisenhower years. And the economy boomed during all that period. There were plenty of jobs. There's plenty of things that need to be done in this world, but you can't make money at it. Building roads, rebuilding bridges, more schools, better hospitals. There's a lot of things that you can't get rich at, but that society needs. And we're not doing it because we're worrying about the deficit.
Sandy?
I think this is another case where we're stuck with a debate which is very hard to settle as far as I can see. The way in which you get an economy that has gone into deep recession because of a fiscal crisis to move out of it is something we don't seem to know much about in this world of woe. Fiscal crises last a long time.
Financial crisis.
Financial crises, yes. I mean, the banking crises, to put it crassly. And they're very different from the kind of standard recessions that we have where stocks build up and, then there's a downturn and it's relatively short term and all of that. But there's actually a paper in one of the economic journals, I've now forgotten which one, in which looks at the the political after effects of financial crises. And it turns out that they're very consistently accompanied by the sort of frightening reaction that you see in the Tea Party, which makes it extremely difficult to pursue a lot of the policies that you and other people and me would be suggesting as possibly good policies. And all the time, when I think about these questions, I come back to these political questions about, well, most of the things I can think of that would help seem politically impractical. And most of the things that seem to be politically practical don't seem to be very helpful, and in many cases are counterproductive. So at this point, maybe I'm ready to retire. It's a very tough choice.
I'm Jay Rosengard. I teach at the Kennedy School. I'd like to go back to your comment, David. Traditionally, you don't mind if somebody's very wealthy as long as you think you or your kids can be Bill Gates, right? And I'd like to introduce a concept of the Gatsby curve. When you said people have a feeling they're stuck, it's more than a feeling. I think it's been well documented now. And the idea is, for example, if you live in poverty, the likelihood that your kids will live in poverty is much higher than, say, most European countries today. And we always looked at the U.S. as a land of opportunity, high social mobility, and so on. And so if you think of inequality not so much as a static concept, but dynamic, and you think of equality or inequality of opportunity, I think that might explain a lot of the change in the political dynamics. So I'd like to get your perspective about the Gatsby curve and how that might inform the current debate.
Sandy spends a lot of his time on this very kind of question.
There's no question if you just look at it, if you make the graph that you see for the Gatsby curve, there's that relationship. It's a correlation. There's no evidence that shows that when inequality goes up, mobility goes down. The only country which I've studied carefully is the United States. And I can't find any evidence that the rate of mobility is going down in this country. It's not as high as it is in Europe, that's true. I mean, and we're talking here only about mobility, fathers and mothers' incomes, family income to family income. I'm not talking, the United States looks much better if you look at occupational mobility. We're kind of in the middle of the pack. But if you just look at the history so far, there's not. Now, then the people who are the prophets of doom, with whom I spend a lot of time, say, well, look at what's happening in education. And there is some education evidence that access, or the probability of finishing college is becoming more related to family background than it was in the past, or more related to parental income in particular. And there's also some evidence that the test score gap between the bottom and the top of the income distribution, so the difference between rich and poor children's test scores, not really rich, by the way, just, well off, has widened somewhat. Well, if that's true, we may be coming to an era in which the rate of mobility between generations will fall, but we're still waiting for any evidence that that's actually happening. And we're well into this period of the rise of inequality, so it could have happened already, and we don't see it yet. But I would say one big thing I've concluded about the effects of inequality when you go to try to study them is it probably takes a long time for most of these effects to work their way through. And we don't know how long that time is, which makes it more or less impossible to actually study them scientifically. I mean, because if you say, well, after something happens, some other thing will happen, but I don't know how long it'll be. Well, you sit around and wait for a while. If it doesn't happen, you say, oh, well, it's just going to take longer. Time will support my views. Well, this is a hard theory to refute. I mean, we've had a lot of people who went up on mountains and said the world was going to come to an end, and then it didn't, and they came down and said, well, I'm right, but just not today. And, so, I'm not sure.
I'm less sanguine. I'm somewhat convinced by Bob Putnam's work that there's what's happening at the very bottom is so terrifying in terms of opportunities and the like that it's doubly worrisome. And one of the challenges of looking at mobility is that here's what you do: is you look at kids, you look at their parents' income, and then you wait until the kids are the age of their parents, and then you see if their income, how it varies to what their parents was. So by definition, you're kind of a generation behind, and that's the question. Of course, the claim that next generation will be different is easy to assert and hard to prove, and that's the challenge.
We can be sure it will be different.
No, that's for sure. I think that's exactly right. I do also think that the question of mobility is quite fundamental. It is interesting that there is actually quite a lot of mobility no matter how you cut it. It's really, most people, the first time they take a close look at it, are struck by how much there is, not how little. But the second point I would make is it's measured funny. It's measured in the following way. Typically when we measure mobility is, okay, what are the odds if you're in the bottom 20% of the income distribution that you get to the top or the middle or whatever, okay? So that by definition is independent of whether there's real economic growth going on. And at the end of the day, I'm one of the people, I'll use Ireland as an example. In the ongoing debate about how you should measure poverty, in the US we've always loved this absolute notion, and in Europe they've always loved this relative notion. It's really just inequality. And Ireland in recent years, until very recently when it's collapsed a bit, has been growing like gangbusters. Just growing like gangbusters and becoming more unequal. Okay? So the Europeans were harping on how terrible it is that there's so much more poverty in Ireland than there used to be, because poverty is measured as relative to the 50th percentile. Well, if you go to Ireland, nobody was unhappy. This is like a good thing, because everyone was doing a whole lot better. So it is, you can't, I mean, there are both. And I do think at the end of the day, the real politically potent issue is what's happening in the middle class. And the real unambiguous truth is, for quite a long time, the middle class actually hasn't been doing very well, and their kids have not been doing much better. And when you have, in most countries, when it really no longer seems that your kids are going to do better than you, or maybe even as well as you, that's just somehow unbelievably potent. And then you start looking for scapegoats. And some of those scapegoats will look like the people below. Some of them will look like immigrants. Some of them will look like the rich people. But one of the things that's also true is it's really, really hard when you're in the wrong place to figure out how to get to a better place. And we do have historical analogies and examples of unions in some periods and other things. But each economic era is different. That said, I guess I would end on this note and then ask Sandy again. I think this is actually quite compellingly interesting time, and one where the politics we're used to may well change. There's Richard Zeckhauser was positing to me just yesterday a kind of tipping point. And it's not just in this area. I think there's a whole sense of frustration in this country that there are a bunch of big issues. I see Bill Clark here on things around sustainability or climate change or you name it, where we say, come on, this is something that's fomenting. And for a while, everybody is just miserable because it's just a disaster everywhere you turn, you can't do anything and so forth. And sometimes that leads to really dramatic and interesting changes. And exactly where those lead, I don't know. But it does seem to me it is actually a time when thoughtful people have the capacity to help shape and nurture different directions and all that. And the only thing I would just say is inequality and welfare and all these things is one of those classic areas where everyone's an expert. Everyone knows what's really going on because they've had a conversation. And what's great about Sandy Jencks is he has those conversations and then he looks at the data. Sandy, how would you end?
There's an old Chinese curse where you live in interesting times. We definitely live in interesting times in that sense. And what would I say about what you should do? What I think I would say about what we should do is try to pay attention to the things that you don't want to believe. I spend all my time trying to pay attention to things I don't want to believe. It's very hard. The things I don't want to believe, first of all, if I don't want to believe them, it's often because I don't believe them, and paying attention to the things you don't believe seems like a real waste of time. The things I do believe are so complicated. But paying attention to the things you don't believe is sort of the only way I at least find I learn anything about this subject.
That's a wonderful sentiment. So please join me in thanking Sandy.